On Monday, March 13th, 2023, a Saudi trans woman named Eden Knight committed suicide. In Twitter circles, her story began to trend, particularly among trans activists and allies. Stories about her kindness, generosity, and hopefulness for the future flooded the timelines of those close to her and those adjacent. I never knew Eden, but through the stories shared about her from those who did, I quickly felt familiar with her and her story. The note that indicated her passing also made the rounds. Her story should be more widely known. She was manipulated, separated from her support system and friends, lied to and mentally abused for months on end by a group of people hired by her family. This led many to rightfully blame her family and the people who forced her detransition and isolation for her suicide. It was a first-hand example of how denying gender-affirming care can lead to suicide, something many anti-trans conservative commentators love to deny. As Eden's story gained traction, in no small part thanks to the efforts of trans journalists and activists trying to get her story into the mainstream, several large journalistic outlets began to cover her passing. It should be a more high-profile story after all, due in no small part to the international nature of her restraint and the amount of money surrounding the events of Eden's death. But aside from these investigations, Eden's death wouldn't go on to spark any riots. There would be no impromptu marches for trans rights. She passed quietly, heard only by those who were listening. Less than a week after Eden's passing, Kelly Jean Kay, an outspoken anti-transgender bigot, held the Let Women Speak rally in Melbourne, Australia. The planning of this rally had been in the works for a while. It had nothing to do with Eden's story. However, how it played out has everything to do with the state of transphobia internationally. The Let Women Speak rally had your garden variety transphobia on display from right-wing ideologues, not really any different from the average Daily Wire transphobic tirades. Just replace the failed actors with failed mother figures and you've got the gist. Lots of gender essentialism, people preaching an ideology that women are little more than body parts and whoever doesn't have those body parts isn't a woman, no matter how society treats them at large. Nothing too special about it. Except for the Nazis. As the rally was ongoing, footage began circulating of black-clad neo-Nazis doing a Nazi salute and sporting flags bearing the Nazi emblem outside the Parliament House in Melbourne, prompting understandable outrage and outcry from politicians. You know who didn't speak out? The TERFs who ran the rally. I suppose they were too busy having their central casting Batman goons strangle-holding women at their Let Women Speak rally. Less than a week after Eden's barely publicized death, at the hands of, let's not mince words, conservative attitudes about trans people. Eden's blood is on the hands of her family, who would rather have a dead child than a happy one. The lies perpetrated by people like Kelly Jean Kay, that trans people are monstrous perverts, autogynephiles trying to invade women's spaces, are the same kind that get absorbed by no small amount of parents who find out their kids are trans or non-binary. But without institutional support, what can trans people do? We can lobby our politicians, of course, but there are entire platforms, businesses now relegated to transphobia. People like Matt Walsh, Ben Shapiro, and most recently Michael Knowles have helped to create this pocket industry in conservative spaces dedicated solely to trans hate. And what started for alt-right commentators as just asking questions and defending women, the same points touted by TERFs, has quickly escalated to a much more exterminationist-minded rhetoric.
Transgenderism must be eradicated from public life entirely. The whole preposterous ideology at every level.
Michael Knowles, desperate to get some of Matt Walsh's desperate little spotlight, recently went on several tirades explicitly saying that trans people should be eradicated from public life. Of course, when called out on this, he doubled back, cloaking his meaning in doublespeak. He just meant trans ideology should be eliminated from public life. He's not advocating for extermination of anyone, just their way of life. It's not a genocide, just the destruction of a people's way of life. What's the definition of genocide? But we've got Biden in our corner, everyone. Yep, old Joe came out in the wake of a metric shit ton of anti-trans legislation to say that he stands with trans folks. And that's about it. But he's on our side, the left. So, I'm sure he'll get the job done, like with stimulus checks and environmental regulations and cutting war funding And, so then, what are trans people and activists supposed to do? The moral arc of the universe is long and may bend towards justice, but until justice is done, how can trans people and their allies make sure that we stay defended and safe? How do we make sure that the government and rich assholes just can't do whatever they want to trans people? Because every day as a trans person, it's a little bit scarier. While a majority of Americans don't hate trans people, a vocal minority managed to go almost unnoticed, attempting to ban gender-affirming care, ban trans people from using the correct bathrooms, and constantly escalating their rhetoric with comparisons and allusions to violence. How long until those illusions go away and we're left with open calls for violence? Not long. Oh shit, I'm a video game channel. Oof, this has been a pretty hard political turn, huh? All the Nazis and transphobia. You know what? Let's talk about a video game. In January 2023, Sandra Moen released a satirical FPS game, Turfenstein 3D. Obviously made an homage to the classic id Software shooter Wolfenstein 3D, Turfenstein recasts all the Nazis as TERFs, priests, and other stereotypical opponents of trans people. It gained some light traction in alt-right circles, but it wasn't until Fox News picked up the story that I even heard of it. Naturally, the conservative media outlet painted the game in the least subtly threatening light possible, saying it tasked players with hunting down women and priests, though the truth is closer to the TERF and priests in the game ravenously hunting the player who's defending herself with violent force. Standing her ground, if you will. There's a joke to be made about a castle doctrine here somewhere. Castle Wolfenstein doctrine, there we go. The Fox News write-up is also careful to call TERFs who get killed opponents of trans ideology, as if to make it clear that the game is about murdering people who just oppose an ideology. All this carnage over a simple difference of opinion. Why can't we all just get along, says Fox News. In a cheeky little move, the article quotes the game's page saying, quote, brings to light the very real transphobic violence many transgender people face just for existing. But the link put over the words very real transphobic violence, instead of linking to, I don't know, actual statistics, either proving or disproving the claim like a real journalist might do, instead links to another Fox News article talking about the backlash streamers might get for not playing the new Harry Potter game. It's like they're saying violence. What transphobic violence? Look at these Twitch streamers who are sad people don't want them supporting this children's franchise. They could lose their jobs. Keep in mind, none of them did. And the entire controversy about Hogwarts Legacy is already blown over. People have forgotten about it. Naturally, with such a series of ringing endorsements, I had to pick the game up. I mean, I'm strapped for cash, but $5 for a Wolfenstein clone? Why not? Here's the thing. Turfenstein 3D isn't even worth the very limited controversy generated by the Fox News article, which was a transparent attempt to dogpile a single developer months after the game came out. It didn't gain any traction, so the transphobic right didn't pay much attention. It's a fine game on its own merits, at least for $5. There's clear love for the original id Software gem, with some solid brain-teasing level design and the same layered puzzle box with keys designed for levels. The combat is crunchy and fast-paced, aided by some gooey gore and nice sound effects. The dog sound, however, is awful. It's terrible. It's like a squeaky wheel in a store shopping cart. There's also an issue with difficulty. The enemies are placed throughout levels, but work on an alert system, so when one is made aware of your presence, all the ones in the area will come flocking to you. Every enemy in the level. It's a bit of an oversight that can make for some intense firefights and empty exploration, and needless challenge as the game progresses. But indie development being what it is, the game as a whole is fine. It's excessively violent, ludicrously gory, and to someone who knows it's making a political statement, might be seen as inciting violence. But you know what? Turfenstein 3D is what we need right now. I've been through plenty of comment sections scoffing at how violent it is, that trans activists are the real fascists for advocating violence, that the comparison the game makes between Nazis and gender criticals is absurd. Trans people, obviously, are the real problem. Trans violence, trans suicide? Look at how violent they are. Another piece of coverage for the game came from the website Redux, a radical trans exclusionary feminist outlet that didn't really cover the game so much as try to smear its creator. The article does nothing but misgender Moen, and when it refers to her, relies on spurious and sensationalized claims about her past. She has a public interest in porn, and she was involved in an incident in a school locker room where someone claimed she exposed herself to a cis woman. However, nothing became of this case. They have to admit that. Nothing ever became of it. But what's next in the article? Here's a trans person with a slightly unflattering picture who called Moen brave. See, this is the kind of person who wants to take away your rights as a woman. This person also works in Norway to help reclassify sexual attractions and update the language around sexual fetishes away from being mental health conditions. Because as all real women know, all kinks are mental illnesses, which is the only reason a transgender person would dress femininely. It's a kink. They just get off on it, and it's also a mental illness. Wait, what was this article about? Turfenstein 3D, a game in which you play a trans person who's been taken prisoner following a dystopian takeover of transphobes. It's a silly, far-fetched premise, isn't it? The trans people would be taken prisoner, forced to detransition. That who they are as people would be denied by bigots who are in positions to profit from their misery. It seems ridiculous. It might seem ridiculous. Here's a castle full of armed guards marching around like Nazis, pointing guns at a trans person who's simply trying to survive, so she defends herself with force if necessary. That's one way to look at it. Another way is to see a crazy man who wants to kill women, hunting and killing those he disagrees with, inciting violence against his ideological opponents. The game is designed to be controversial. It's explicitly gory and violent, literally about murdering people. In many ways, it displays the fear so many radical anti-trans bigots constantly drone on about, including male aggression and violence, how trans women really just hate women and want to hurt them and take away their spaces. But like the real-life arguments around trans rights, these kind of talking points, pointing at a few screenshots and saying, look at the violence they want to do, ignores the important context of why the violence is necessary in the game. To survive. It's shadowboxing. Like the Daily Wire chuds ramped up their rhetoric like the TERFs who allowed Nazis at their rally. It starts as simple criticism and continues to escalate. It starts, in bad faith of course, at simply being concerned. Doesn't matter if it's concern for children or concern for women's spaces or violence or mental health. Worry is an easy thing to spread, especially when you can make it look like 0.1% of the population is taking over, is taking your children, they're evil. For these claims, you don't need context. When a TERF sees a game like this, they see a threat of violence. When I see a game like this, I see radical art. Violence in protest art is nothing new. It's an easy way to get a point across. Everyone understands the threat of violence. Even God, who the conservative right loves to tout as a guiding force for their bigotry, got violent from time to time. You may be shocked to know I grew up in a religious household. I went to church school, and there's one lesson I still think about. When I learned the difference between killing and murder to the church. Because murder is a no-no. That's pretty high on the list, actually. But killing, God kills. God allows people to kill, he even commands them to. Murder is evil, it's selfish, but killing is justified. Violence is condoned by God. Even by Christ himself, the famous story of Jesus in the temple, overturning tables of money changers and merchants. The scripture itself notes Jesus beats them. Like the difference between killing and murder, this initially confused me. How could Jesus advocate for peace, for loving your neighbor as yourself, and then turn around and hurt people he disagreed with? Then my teacher taught me the idea of righteous anger. It was described to me as an anger felt by God himself, that something was an affront, not a common human anger that would lead to a fight or revenge, but something deeply disordered in the world, where the only recourse was to fight back with force. Like when Jesus saw the people being cheated and led astray in the temple, he was filled with righteous anger, an anger sanctioned by God himself. There's no shortage of Bible verses aimed at defending the poor. Despite the often contradictory, sometimes vitriolic, and misguided religions he inspired, Jesus seems like a pretty righteous dude, no pun intended. Certainly more holy than anyone waving the Bible around to justify their prejudices. So when I think of Eden, I have a hard time getting sad. Anger comes much easier. Of course, I would never seriously advocate violence against anyone. Anger doesn't necessarily mean violence, but it does mean action. Making a game that allows you to kill people who want to see you eradicated from public life, people who hate you for no reason and wish to strip you of your rights, that's action to me. In every frame of this goofy, silly, absurdist tribute game, you feel a righteous anger. There's a sense of liberation, a relief that comes with the simple act of pressing a button and watching the people who want you dead disappear. But it's just pixels, shadows dancing on a screen. Like arguing in a comment section and scoring sweet dunks on TERFs and bigots on Twitter. It's a small dopamine rush that briefly feels better, but it doesn't actually help you or anyone else. The fight for trans rights doesn't need to be violent, but it does need to be angry. Martin Luther King Jr., one of the great scions of civil rights, an advocate of peaceful protest, was righteously angry when he wrote his famous letter from Birmingham jail. If you haven't read it, it remains a prescient and powerful piece of heartfelt writing. It is a call against injustice, a rationale for civil disobedience, and when all other options have been extinguished, violence. In the very opening, he lays out the idea that civil rights are not an isolated issue, that it is not the cause of one state or people, but of a nation. He says, "Moreover, I am cognizant of the interrelatedness of all communities and states. I cannot sit idly by in Atlanta and not be concerned about what happens in Birmingham. Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. We are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. Never again can we afford to live with the narrow provincial outside agitator idea. Anyone who lives inside the United States can never be considered an outsider anywhere within its bounds." He brings up the importance of legality in bigotry and prejudice, calling attention to Nazi Germany as a prime example. Quote, "We should never forget that everything Hitler did in Germany was legal, and everything the Hungarian freedom fighters did in Hungary was illegal. It was illegal to aid and comfort a Jew in Hitler's Germany." So, Dr. King makes many good points throughout the letter, all of which are valid, well thought out, and hard to refute. I'd encourage anyone interested in any struggle for rights into a positive peace, which is the presence of justice, who constantly says, "I agree with you in the goal you seek, but I cannot agree with your methods of direct action," who paternalistically believe he can set the timetable for another man's freedom, who lives by a mythical concept of time, and who constantly advises the black man to wait for a more convenient season. Shallow understanding from people of goodwill is more frustrating than absolute misunderstanding from people of ill will. Lukewarm acceptance is much more bewildering than outright rejection. End quote. It is fitting that Dr. King's words remain as prescient to many of the struggles of trans people today as black people then, and honestly, black people still now. The LGBTQ and trans communities and their struggles are inseparable from the history of struggles of Black Americans and Americans of color as a whole. Of course, none of this is to draw parallels between the experiences of trans people and black people in the 1960s South. One form of bigotry isn't comparable to another, but rather to highlight Dr. King's important and evergreen observations amid injustice and prejudice. That we each have a duty to freedom and liberty, that laws are not and have never been the guiding principle for what's right, and that someone who stands by and does nothing is more dangerous than someone actively doing harm. It's hard to be trans right now. While trans people have more visibility and understanding than ever, it's been a two-sided blade cutting deep into the core of America's bigotry. The trans issue has let all kinds of settled bigotry seep to the surface of the wound, with plenty of pundits and writers now advocating rollbacks of gay marriage and broad LGBTQ acceptance that became regular in this country when I was a child. Of course, it's not just America either. Britain, Australia, and plenty of other places are facing waves of alt-right political influence, which only tempers anti-transgender movements and the bigotry they inspire. We need moderates to get in the game. If you know a trans person, if you don't, you need to be going to city council meetings. You need to become active in your community. You need to make sure that if you really believe that trans people aren't a threat to anyone, that trans kids deserve proper treatment, that we're not groomers and perverts, and that we just want to live our lives as happily as we can, like everyone else, then you need to be prepared to let everyone know. Because we can't do it alone. Nobody can fight alone. It's not enough to have goodwill. Because as we've already seen, the people who want to eradicate trans people from public life won't stop there. They're allying themselves with radical and violent groups, or at the very least, not pushing back when those radical groups show up. They're escalating their rhetoric to include other minorities and groups, and they're making strides because of the platform they've grown due to transphobia. It can seem hopeless, but it's not. At least not if we work together. And looking at the state of the world, seeing trans people die through suicide or any of the awful murders we've seen this year alone, it's hard not to see the world Moen envisions in Turfenstein 3D. One where the transphobes win. They get to do what they want. They get to force their beliefs on us. Put us in conversion camps, detransition adults, make sure nobody ever sees trans or queer people in public life ever again. And on the other end of that possibility, you see why Moen made the game so violent. It's not a threat. It's not an encouragement to hunt down TERFs and bigots. It's a warning, one that everybody should know by now. Bigotry will always remain. It will always take new forms, but will fight for the same old causes. And when the target group gets pushed far enough, somebody will push back. And if that day ever comes, I like to think that God will be on our side.
You can't have guns, but faithful servants of the Democratic Party can. And that makes sense because, like all totalitarians, they want a monopoly on force, right? So debate ends at that point. When one side has all the firearms, you don't have to argue. You say, well, you can't change your sex. Shut up, bigot! Bang, bang! Shut up, bigot! Bang, bang! Shut up, bigot! Bang, bang!
Transgenderism must be eradicated from public life entirely.
Last weekend inside the Seton Library was an intimidating disruption. Police responded to reports of people shouting homophobic slurs at children and parents. On Saturday, protesters downtown said kids and drag performers
Swarm of extremists who Idaho police say came to riot. 31 suspected white nationalists zip-tied and arrested blocks from a pride festival.
Here, Diamond Jackson McDonald was the latest trans black woman murdered in Philadelphia in the early hours of Thanksgiving last week.
Community leaders say she was a beloved and active member.
At the entrance to the park where she died, the flowers left in memory of Brianna Jai. It was down along the old railway line that a 16-year-old life was cut short. A life that, like so many, played out on social media, in TikTok videos like this. And a life that's been honored by her family.
Cashapp Henderson, Brazil Johnson, and Regina Maya Allen were each shot to death between last summer and late last month. The victims range from 28 to 35.
We're not here to make a compromise with these communists. We're not here to be nice and friendly. We are revolutionaries, and we are here to destroy the sick and rotten society.
Transgenderism must be eradicated from public life entirely. The whole preposterous ideology at every level.
And the struggle was to deal with these problems. Now, certainly they were difficult problems. They were humiliating conditions. By the thousands, we protested these conditions. We made it clear that it was ultimately more honorable to accept jail cell experiences than to accept segregation and humiliation. By the thousands, students and adults decided to sit in at segregated lunch counters to protest conditions there. And when they were sitting at those lunch counters, they were in reality standing up for the best in the American dream and seeking to take the whole nation back to those great wells of democracy which were dug deep by the founding fathers in the formulation of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence. Many things were gained as a result of these years of struggle.